Welcome, everyone, to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 79. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier on in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, John, I'm doing great and highly caffeinated. We're both pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to virtual enlightenment.
So let's take a trip.
All right, Nick. Hey, how are you doing during these times of COVID isolation? Just checking in on you.
Doing just fine, man. I am probably one of the few who is enjoying the isolation time because it means I get more accomplished. Just more personal, nerdy, tinkering things that I can do without having to leave the house, you know?
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean. Like, I think I'm just like thanking the privilege that we have right now, that, you know, we're not in positions that have been eliminated, and, hopefully it looks like we're surviving. I don't know, we're in this ambiguous space where I'm not sure if we turn the corner or if it's a pause before like additional like infections or whatever. We're recording on May 23rd, so people listen to this in the future and know maybe kind of how things are going better than we do right now. I hope things are going to get better. I hope that people get back to work and, they're safe. But, here's us at the Nerd Journey crew, wishing you health and happiness and good vibes.
Yep. Do the best you can out there.
That's right. Wash your hands. Stay socially distanced. So with that in mind, this week, Nick, we're talking about receiving feedback, right?
Yes. Just like the feedback we were giving each other on fun technical projects right before this episode started.
That's right. So just a little bit of, structural notes. We're going to be talking about sources of feedback, types of feedback, and the different, structures that are out there for different ways to think about feedback and the taxonomy, I guess. And then finally, tactics for effectively receiving feedback. Maybe it'll also segue and like give hints on how to give feedback appropriately, but mostly we're focusing on the receiving end this time around. So with that in mind, let's jump into it. We originally, when we were sitting around brainstorming this topic, we thought about where feedback comes from, right? And so sources of feedback, I think pretty quickly we came to the conclusion that you definitely get feedback from leadership, right? Your direct manager or, leaders above that level, maybe one level up or, multiple levels up who are giving feedback for the organization as a whole. You can get feedback from your peers and you can get feedback from people who report to you, either formally or informally. And then we're kind of struggling for other sources of feedback, but then we went outside of ourselves, and obviously there's other people who have done a lot of thinking about this kind of thing, and so we came across this article. They identified and I think crystallized our thinking about other sources. So there's feedback that comes from outside the organization. They called it from customers, but not everybody is in a situation where feedback from outside the organization is a customer. Sometimes it's like peer organizations or upstream or downstream, right? It could be customers or vendors. And then you also get feedback from just pure data, or they called it objective data. So sometimes you can have a metric that that you're being judged by, and just looking at the metric gives you feedback on the situation. So I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it, an interesting construction, because I think you and I were both struggling to articulate those things, right? It's like, so outside, I don't know.
Yeah,
customers.
I agree. Well, it's good because, if I'm someone who works the help desk, how many tickets have I closed? Or how many have been open more than 2 weeks?
Hmm.
It'd be good to know that and just point that out as a measure of how well am I doing based on what the numbers say. There may be more to it than that, but it's a start.
Yeah, absolutely. Or just the customer satisfaction ratings from people that you've been helping, or whatever metric it is that you're using to be measured by. But whatever metric that is, you can just look at it and say, oh, as a result, like here's where I stand. So that's definitely a source of feedback, and outside the organization, you know, be it customer, a partner, a vendor, those kinds of external pieces of feedback are also pretty valuable sources. And people there can tell you, hey, we feel like you're not performing up to standard, or you guys could do better, or you're doing a great job, or we really appreciate how you're doing this. So um, definitely a lot of different sources, and it's not just a manager that's managing you saying, hey, you're doing really well here, or you're not doing so hot here, I need improvement here.
Hey, you're
Right.
doing a great job, John. I just thought you should know.
Thanks, man, I really appreciate it. And yes, and um, but the revelation and understanding that feedback can come from multiple sources is very helpful. Looking where it's coming from, and maybe looking for sources if you're looking for like a 360 review or something like that. All right, so let's get into the different types of feedback that are out there. We look to outside sources once we realized that they were out there, for kind of different ideas of how feedback could be categorized. And again, the corporate communication experts.com.au had that article, Three Types of Feedback. So we looked there. The first kind that they talked about was evaluative, evaluation. Um, so I thought that that was really important to define. They were really talking about feedback that gives you information about where you are, where you stand, either in comparison to peers, in comparison to the population as a whole, in comparison to some objective standard, or in comparison to where you set your own standard. You said you wanted to be here, and here's where you are compared to that. So it's just this evaluation. There's something that I'm evaluating you against. So that is one category. I thought it was kind of cool to have that idea of a specific type of feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say the article seemed to indicate that we shouldn't just do this once a year, that this should be a consistent process of evaluative feedback so that everyone can know the clear expectations and then maybe how those change based on your skill level, abilities, how you've progressed, and so you can actually track the progression over
Yeah.
time and be
And if you
accountable
need
for
to,
the outcomes.
exactly. And if you need to make a correction, let you make a correction in the moment, not a year, or, some significant portion of a year, you know, um, after, you haven't been meeting that standard. So makes a lot of sense. Second type, appreciative, so appreciation. Um, I also thought it was interesting to categorize this as a specific type of feedback. The thank you, the you've done a good job at this. It's not saying compared to a standard, it's just appreciating you for your effort in doing something. And, that is definitely different from an evaluation, right? So it could be, thank you for executing, thank you for doing whatever. It's just expressing appreciation for effort or accomplishment, regardless of whether that was just the person's core responsibility, um, what they're supposed to be doing every day, or, maybe it's just timeliness or above and beyond effort. but it's just that expression of appreciation.
I liked the part where it talked about linking it to the receiver's values, and that would make it more effective, which of course assumes that whoever's giving the feedback would need to know something about the other person's values and who they are as a person.
Right. Like say you are giving appreciative feedback to some other person in some other organization. Um, if you really want it to land, I suppose you could do some research into what that organization values. If they have organizational values that you can put it in terms of, or personal knowledge of that person. And I think that maybe if somebody is giving you appreciation or appreciative feedback, um, and they don't quite know how to put it in terms of your value or the things that you value, then maybe you can like internally maybe restate it in those terms, um, to better take it. Uh, but again, a really interesting way to think about it.
And getting that type of feedback can often help you understand the value you're adding to the organization.
Sure.
You know,
Or in the relationship. Hmm.
relating it to the goals of the organization, where you fit. Yes, you're making a difference, even though maybe you can't see it. I see it.
Hmm. Yeah. Maybe it's also giving you a hint of what the other person values,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
They're appreciative, and as a result, this is where you can think about what it is that they value.
Yeah, it reminded me of the Three Signs of a Miserable Job by Patrick Lencioni, and making sure that people have that purpose.
Yeah, yeah. A purposeless existence leads to misery, I think, was one of the conclusions of that book. Yeah. Um, okay, so the third type of feedback that they categorized was coaching feedback. So that is something which is separate from an evaluation. It's more of an encouragement or guide towards growth, right? And it doesn't have to be based on like a gap in expectations. It can be also based on success that the person's had. So somebody is telling you, hey, good job on that. I think in order for you to keep on succeeding that way, you can do this and this and this. So they're first of all giving you appreciative feedback, and then they're saying, if you want to continue being successful, here's some other things that can help you magnify that type of success. Or they can give you evaluative feedback. Hey, you're way above standard um, in this area of your job. And if you want to become one of the top 1% of the people doing that, then I think that you might want to read this book and pursue this training. Right. So it doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't need to be, hey, you're falling below standard, hey, you're falling behind, or you know, you're close to the bottom among your peers in this area, and provide coaching there.
And if you think about the idea of a coach who's helping athletes, they're always looking for ways for even the most elite athletes to improve. And that's what you would be on the lookout for when coaching maybe a high performer, just as you said.
Right. How do you get that growth? How do you get that, improvement?
How do you take that next iteration?
Improve in the next iteration, yeah. Um, there was also a book that was referenced within the article that we haven't had the ability to read yet. But what was it again?
It,
Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen, I think,
mm-hmm.
were
Thanks
the
for the
authors.
feedback, it was the title.
Right. Thanks for the feedback.
And they also wrote another book called Difficult Conversations. So it sounds like both of those need to go into the Audible library soon for me.
Yeah, yeah. We'll try to read those and maybe report back on the content and whether it's a worthy investment. Cool. So the other source that we looked to was this article from TalkDesk, Types and Sources of Feedback in the Workplace. So the sources I think we had kind of already covered, but the taxonomy that they had for feedback was different from the corporate communication experts. So it was different enough that we wanted to also put this structure out here because it's maybe a slightly different way of thinking about it. So the first type of feedback that they talked about was constructive, right? And so I think this was more of a a way of thinking about it of like levels of effectiveness and actually providing an area to be coached. So if you're providing constructive feedback, you're actually giving pointers in your feedback for ways to improve. So they further broke that down into negative feedback. Hey, you're not doing this well. Positive feedback, you're doing this well. Negative feed forward. I thought that was interesting. You probably don't want to do this in the future in order to avoid these pitfalls or to do better. And then positive feed forward, right? If you keep on doing that, you're going to reach, this positive level and be well on your way towards, goal X. Um, Really interesting framing, and it was, definitely related, but different enough that we wanted to put that framing out there in people's minds as well.
Yeah, I had never heard the feed forward ones. Those were just really interesting.
Yeah, feedback and feed forward, meaning, it's a temporal orientation, right? So positive and negative is, you need to do this and you should stop doing this, or, it's good to do this or it's bad to do this. And then feedback and feed forward is temporal. It was in the past, or you should be doing it in the future, or shouldn't be doing it in the future. Yeah, so very interesting construction of, and this is the constructive feedback, helpful feedback that you can actually take. Um, the second one, I think, aligned with the appreciative feedback from CCE. So that's praise. So I think, again, very, very closely aligned with appreciative feedback. And then finally, criticism. And this was feedback, certainly, but not helpful. So just um, giving you what you've done wrong. That's like maybe a kind of a blunt way to put it, and without the nuance of the actual article, but talking about it in a way that's also not helpful, right? It doesn't give you any way to improve. It's just saying, hey, you've done this and it's no good, right? Judgment, negativity. Um,
Nobody wants to be criticized unless it's
right.
constructive.
Right, right. Um, I think that um, that does it for like the types of feedback. I think it is helpful to have, both sources and types of feedback in your mind when you're getting it to kind of categorize it, right? So you can, an example like maybe a partner organization, someone from a partner organization, lets you know that in order to improve like performance with them, you're going to, doing the more of this would be helpful. So that's, you know, feedback from an outside source. It's a partner organization. Um, and then it is positive feed forward in order to improve things, in order to do even better than you're doing now. Future behavior will help that, right? And it didn't really contain an evaluation, right? So it's not evaluative feedback, but it did give you coaching, right? So here's some things that could help you improve. So, you know, I don't know about you, but in my like engineer brain that we learned from that phrase we learned, um, it helps me to categorize things in order to help me um, break things down and understand why something's helping or not helping, right? That's, thanks Josh Fidel for that phrase, engineering brain, right? So deconstructing something, helping to, which can help understand, why it is or isn't helpful. Like, you get some criticism and you're like, oh, why is this not helping me? Or why am I having this emotional reaction to it? Oh, because it was just an observation about a negative trait, or it was a judgment. And there was no telling me, like, evaluative part of it. It didn't tell me where I was in relation to some kind of standard or my peers or, you know, whatever. And then it didn't contain any coaching. It didn't give me a way to improve it. So all it was criticism, which is why I'm having this emotional reaction. So it's almost like, that just wasn't helpful. So if that person was trying to be helpful, then you could go and say, hey, you made this comment, but it didn't tell me where I stood. There was no evaluation, and then it didn't give me any ways to improve. If you were trying to give me some constructive feedback. So you could go back to the person and ask for those things in order to get something that's actually going to be helpful, or go to somebody else if you don't have a good relationship with that person.
Sure.
um,
I would say that you probably need to take just a little bit of time to get past the emotional part so
Certainly.
that you can let your rational side digest. When we think back to the three ideas in the book Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, it's direct the writer, logical,
Hmm.
motivate the elephant, emotional. So someone may have motivated the elephant to be really upset, and then shape the path forward, which if someone's just giving you something negative, just as you said, John, they're not telling you what the path forward is from there.
Right. Which is why you need more from them or from somebody else. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just, if you're in a situation where you feel like something is not as helpful as it could be, having these categories of feedback is always helpful, to run down, maybe not necessarily in the moment. And maybe you need to circle back with, your supervisor if that's who's giving it to you. Um, or with a peer, whomever it was, afterwards to say, oh, what I was missing was this. What I need more. What would be more helpful is if you could, point me in a direction to, as you said, shape that path forward. Um, so again, I think that just reading the categories was very helpful, and then, putting, I'm trying to remember feedback that I've gotten in the past and say, oh, that gave me an evaluation. Maybe there was less coaching that I needed, but it was definitely, solid in the evaluation. And then, you know, was there negative feedback or positive feedback? Was there positive feed forward? You know, what were the different, things that were given to me, and how would I categorize them? And then maybe you could even say, what I actually need was more negative feedback, like, oh, you're not effective at this. Okay, well, what was it that I was doing that was not effective? What actions was I missing that would have made me more effective? What things could I do in the future that would make me more effective? And I think all of the best feedback that I've ever gotten, now that I look at these categories, contained both, evaluative and, past performance type of feedback, along with future looking, you know, feedback. And, it just makes me appreciative of the management that I've had in the past and in the present. Also, the just general appreciative feedback. I realized that, the company I work for now, Google, has this thing called G thanks, internal, like just the letter G and then thanks, um, where you can kind of give kudos and even like a peer bonus to somebody for doing a really good job, and you have, I mean, a certain number of peer bonuses that you can give each quarter, and then a certain number of just, like, I think maybe unlimited amounts of kudos that you can give out. Hey, thanks for helping me out with this. Really appreciate with you pitching in and doing this, and that kind of appreciative feedback. Since we have, if you have internal tools, then you should use them, and if you don't have internal tools, then you should use your email, your phone, or your face to face when we get to the point where we can do that. I certainly appreciation.
As do we all.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to kind of the final section that we're talking about here, and that is tactics for receiving feedback that makes that feedback more effective, right? Um, there's the things that people who are giving feedback can do that can put it in the best place for the person to take it the best. But then there on the receiving end, there's things that we can do that can make that feedback more effective or less effective. So the first thing I want to talk about was another article um, from the corporate communications experts, which is called Barriers to Effective Feedback Conversation. Um, that I thought was really interesting. Just briefly, I think we're going to again have a link in the show notes. But I wanted to go over the main points. So the subtleties of the article are well worth the time of reading it. Not a huge time investment. Under 10 minutes to read it. But the highlights were the barriers to that effective feedback can be your and the other party's emotions, the relationship between you and the other party, and then resistance in either yourself or the other party to change, or to receiving the feedback. So all of those things can be barriers. Emotions and how you're feeling defensive or offended or any of those things. Can be barriers. So I think at least the tactics that I've found are to, anytime I'm feeling, defensive, it's, is the other person actually meaning to be on the offensive, or are they just trying to offer help, right? Or make a request of me. Um, and so it's a little bit easier to say, okay, let me take that in, let me think about that, and then de-escalate your emotional state. And sometimes that just takes time. That can be, hey, I'm gonna take your guidance, thank you very much. And then later on, go back and say, I think I was feeling defensive in that moment because of this, but I do really appreciate what it is that you said. Um, and here's what what positive steps that I'm going to take, after getting your feedback and your guidance. That's always helpful, to continue the relationship, and if it's especially if it's somebody whose feedback you value, all feedback, you want to solicit it, then that appreciation and thanks, and hey, if I took these actions, does that align with what it is that you were talking about? Um, so I thought that was really good good point to make about emotions and in your relationship. Is it a managerial relationship? Is it maybe just the relationship is rough, and that's a barrier to receiving effective feedback. It might be really good feedback. It might be well coached feedback, um, couched feedback, but maybe there's a damaged relationship between you and the person who's giving it, or not enough of a relationship, so you don't want to hear it, and that's always a problem.
It reminds me of what Ben Bergeron talks about in Chasing Excellence. He references the success equation: event plus response equals outcome. The part that we can control is our response. And that's really hard when our emotions get involved. It's hard not to respond in maybe a way you would prefer not to, until taking
Right.
some time to process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really easy to realize that negative emotions and resistance can be a barrier to getting feedback effectively. But I think that you know positive and affirming um, feedback can too much just be like a reinforcement, like, okay, I'm doing a good job, I need to do that. And maybe when you feel good about something, you miss like the future actions that you could take, or the thinking about continued growth that you could make to be even more effective. So that's something to watch out for too. you know your emotions, it doesn't mean just your negative emotions, and it doesn't, um, sometimes resistance isn't like you're resisting against what the person is saying, but what that person is saying just helps to like solidify like a bias or like a thought that you had in your head, like that they're confirming for you. So they're providing confirmation, which is not a good thing. So um I would say, always make sure that you're trying to work towards growth, and that you're not missing opportunities for growth, regardless of whether you're getting positive feedback or negative feedback, or positive emotion or negative emotion in response to feedback. And then I think we also want to close out with an interesting bit that we read from Manager Tools. Manager Tools didn't have like a specific article about receiving feedback, but they did have something that was related, which was responding to 360 reviews, was 360-degree reviews. Um, and I thought that it was interesting to talk about here in this context because there were some interesting lessons. And one was to focus on the strengths of a of an of feedback. When you get feedback, sometimes you'll get it and it'll say, these 5 categories, you're very, very good and very, very strong, and you're outstanding in these two. You're above average in this other category. And then automatically what we go do is we say, wait, I'm just above average. Like I'm excellent and like outstanding in everything else and just above average here. So then, we figure we become, obsessed with raising that above average instead of raising like all of our like, excellence to outstanding, focusing on our strengths. Um, so that's a that's a pitfall to fall out to watch out for. Especially if you're getting kind of a little bit more evaluative feedback that covers multiple categories. Um, it's dangerous to just focus on the areas of weakness, and you should also make sure um, make sure that the strengths that you're getting align with like you know what you think your strengths are. That was something that was they emphasized, and you should also make sure that those strengths that you got back in your feedback are aligned with the core needs of the role that you have. All important things, right? And then when you think about a weakness, you should only it's really only a weakness if it's below the needs of the role. So if you do get like one category where you're, quote unquote, merely above average, um, what is that? Does that is that really weak, or is it below the requirements for your role, right? If you if you're above average and above average is fine, it's all that you need for the job, but you're excellent and outstanding in every other category. Maybe what you need to do is focus on raising the level of all the things you're excellent and outstanding in to get even further, especially if those things are more aligned with what you need for the job. Right. Um, so just being below your like personal expectations or your personal perceptions of where you are doesn't mean that you're weak in that category. All it means is that, it's, you know, if somebody's evaluated you, then that's where you are in their evaluation. It doesn't mean that it's the most important thing for you to focus on. Um, and it maybe doesn't even need improvement, right? Unless the evaluation is needs improvement. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Usually we are our toughest critics.
Yeah.
Like you said, if we don't measure up to what we think we should get.
Hmm.
I remember I had a manager when I worked at Walmart back at the pharmacy, and
Hmm.
you have the different ratings, and he was saying this isn't like if you don't get the highest rating, you didn't get an A. You can't equate it to A, B, C, D, E, F.
Hmm.
And that was hard not to do
Sure. Sure.
because you want to be the best, right?
Yeah. And, imagine if you got things like, if you are pre-sales technical resource and you're like, oh, your customer facing technology level is a 10 out of 10. You're in the upper 1%, and your ability to communicate problems back to your internal product team, you're like 9 out of 10. And your the way that you dress is 6 out of 10. um, do you want to spend all your time like raising the level of your how you're dressing, or you know is that really aligned? I mean, you tell me, right? For some roles, like the way that you dress can be like critically aligned to your success and core part of the job. um, but for other people, maybe not.
All I'll say is I'll refer our listeners back to episode 9 and John's rant on how to dress for an interview. Still one of my favorite all time moments. Go listen to that, and then you tell me if he's full of it after that last comment.
uh, yeah, it's a screening. It's an unfair screening. Anyway, I'm not. I'm trying not to climb onto that high horse.
That was a bait and switch, and you took the bait almost.
um, a final piece from manager tools I thought that was really important was like, at a minimum, you should acknowledge the feedback, right? Acknowledge that the feedback existed. Some of the article was relevant if you were a manager receiving a 360 report that included members of your team and you're reviewing it with your team. Like, hey, tactics for going over, like, here are some areas that were strengths and here's some areas where I have, you know, uh, space to improve, rather than diving into like every little thing. But if you're getting feedback directly from a person, it always is at the very least to polite to acknowledge that feedback. um, and like I said, if you aren't able to respond in the moment, because of your emotional level, um, then my addendum is like, if you if it takes time for you to calm down in order to to evaluate the feedback and then say, hey, I'm going to have an action item that I'm going to be working on, based on your feedback. Does that align with kind of what you were thinking? Then, take the time. It's always better to, if the person hasn't been specific enough, then it always helps to get like that specificity. Cool. Well, I think that's all I had. Anything else pop in your mind?
I
Or
just
should we get out of here?
I just thought I'd share an interesting story. So this is
Yeah.
in the world of academia,
Mm-hmm.
and I got some feedback from my numerical analysis professor on my skill level. That,
Mm-hmm.
I was in this class, I was struggling, I was actually afraid I was going to fail. He said, "You're not going to fail, but A, B, out of the question."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that crushes you when you want to make A's all the
Mm-hmm.
time, right? And he said, "You have a lot of holes in your knowledge of the prerequisites to get to this course." And I'm sure there were other things after that, but
Mm-hmm.
I had other professors that were telling me, no, no, that's not right. You're doing so great. You know, all these things. And I would encourage anyone listening to take it and think about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I thought about it, even though it rocked my world in terms of a confidence downer,
Mm-hmm.
this guy was right. I didn't really have the foundation as well as I thought once I
Mm-hmm.
made it to that level. Fast forward a few years, I become a high school math teacher and I have to teach calculus. Well, you better believe that I learned it at a foundational level really well, but I didn't learn it really well until then.
Mm.
So he was right on. You might consider that some criticism or negative feedback without really shaping the path forward. And I guess I wasn't sure completely what to do at the time. I just did the best I could, tried to fill in the holes, but in one semester, how much can you fill in from all the stuff that's missing?
Yeah. If you don't have those trigonometric identities memorized at a certain point, it's tough to do it in the moment.
No, it wasn't those. It was a bunch of other things, which I won't rehash here. This isn't a math podcast, although it could be.
Yeah, no. Trigonometric identities were my issue. To this day,
yeah,
I don't know them.
Oh, they're fantastic. Speaking of identity, remember, we want people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Help us find our identity with the listenership out there. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter at Nerd Journey.
All right, farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman on Twitter. For Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1, John. That's all you need. Adios.
That's actually the only one that I do know.